Have you ever just had that feeling that something isn't quite right with the economy? You know, like the rules of the game are changing right under our feet? Well, in this explainer, we're going to unpack a pretty powerful argument from our source material that suggests to really understand our future, we actually need to look back, way back, like 2,000 years into the past. And this is where things get really interesting. This quote is from the famous economist John Maynard Keynes. It kind of hints at this hidden process, right? A silent transfer of wealth that for the most part, we never even see happening.
So, what is this theft he's talking about? How does it even work? Now, the source material for this explainer, it makes a really bold claim. It calls the modern monetary system, and I'm quoting here, the biggest scam in the history of mankind. Whoa. Okay, so let's dive into this and see what they're actually talking about.
So, according to our source, how does this supposed scam really work? Well, it all starts with the very way our currency is created. It's a four-step process.
Okay, so here's the playbook. According to our source, step 1, the government spends more than it takes in, to pay for things like social programs or wars. Step 2, to cover that gap, the Treasury issues bonds, which are really just fancy IOUs. Step 3, the Federal Reserve steps in and buys those bonds with currency it literally creates out of thin air. And finally, step 4, the banks get that new currency and multiply it through lending. The bottom line here is that debt is basically being turned into currency, with new money just flooding into the system at every single stage.
So what's the real-world impact of all this? Well, since the Federal Reserve was created back in 1913, the US dollar has lost a staggering 95% of its purchasing power. Think about that. What used to cost you a nickel now costs $1. And our source argues this isn't an accident, it's a feature of the system.
Now, you might be thinking, okay, this sounds like a modern problem. But here's the kicker. Our source material points out that this pattern, it's ancient. In fact, we can see an almost identical blueprint in the rise and fall of the Roman Empire.
This timeline is pretty wild. You can see this really striking parallel. Both Rome and the USA started out with what's called sound money, actual gold and silver. But look what happens. Both of them abandon it to finance a huge war. For Rome, the big turning point was the Second Punic War. For the US, it was the Vietnam War, when President Nixon officially cut the dollar's last tie to gold.
And to really get this, we have to understand a super important distinction the source makes between money and currency. So currency, that's what we use every day to buy things. But it's not a great store of value. Why? Because governments can print as much of it as they want. Money, on the other hand, is a store of value. And historically, that's only been gold and silver, because you can't just print more gold. So the crucial point is, the moment a nation ditches real money for currency, it basically opens the floodgates to debasement.
So how does this whole historical echo play out today? Well, according to the source, the parallels go way beyond just coins and paper bills. They actually extend to the very methods governments use to manage their populations, especially when the economy starts to get shaky.
You've probably heard this phrase before, right? Bread and circus. In the final days of the Roman Empire, this was the go-to strategy. The leaders would hand out free grain, that's the bread, and stage these spectacular, violent games in the Colosseum, the circus. And it was all designed to distract the population from the fact that their economy and their freedoms were crumbling.
And this is where the source really connects the dots between then and now. Rome's debased coins, well, that's today's quantitative easing. The ancient bread and circus, that's today's welfare programs and mass media entertainment. And Rome's massive military expansion, it's mirrored in today's enormous national defense spending. The source is arguing that the playbook is exactly the same, just with a modern twist.
I mean, listen to this. The Roman satirist Juvenal wrote this almost 2,000 years ago. Give them bread and circus, and they will never revolt. It just goes to show you, this is a timeless strategy for keeping control when the system itself is starting to fail.
Our source boils this whole historical pattern down into what it calls the 7 stages of empire. It starts with sound money, goes through building a huge military and going to war, and it always ends in a currency collapse. Now, as you look at this list, just ask yourself, which stage do you think we're in right now?
All right, so this brings us to the final act, the end game. How does this cycle actually end,
And what does our source predict is just around the corner?
Now this chart, this is just mind-blowing. Look at this. It took the United States over 200 years, from 1776 all the way to 2008, to create $825 billion of base currency. But in just a few years since 2008, that number has skyrocketed into the trillions. This isn't just an expansion, it's a vertical explosion of currency creation.
So you might be wondering, with all that new currency, why haven't we seen insane hyperinflation yet? Well, the missing ingredient is this thing called velocity. It's basically the speed at which currency changes hands. Right now, velocity is pretty low. But here's the thing. Velocity is all about psychology. The source argues that when people finally lose faith in the currency, they'll start spending it as fast as they can. And that's the spark that lights the whole fire.
So what's the conclusion? What's the end game? The source predicts this cycle will end with nothing less than the greatest wealth transfer in history. As faith in the currency finally collapses, purchasing power is going to be violently ripped away from people holding currency and paper assets, and it's going to rush toward those holding real, tangible money, like gold and silver.
Time and time again, we've seen empires follow this exact path, and it has always ended the same way. And so, the source material leaves us with one final sobering question. After centuries of evidence showing us this pattern, do we really think that this time it's going to be different?